Hi, everyone. It's Dark Journalist. Thank you for being here. And we've got something very special tonight. As a matter of fact, I think we might consider this possibly one of the most important broadcasts that we've ever done. And if not the most important, because the information that I'm going to bring out tonight isn't anywhere. You can't find it, and I've looked. Certainly, there's a decent amount about Tesla and Trump's uncle and how Trump's uncle went through his papers. But I found things in relation to that that tie in so well with what we've been working on here with our X theme that I think it's going to do to you what it did to me, which is put us in a different place when looking at all of this material. And it's really great to have everyone here. It's already a huge crowd. And of course, we have the excellent and lovely Olivia with us.
Hi, everyone.
It's great to have her here. And of course, give her your questions, because tonight we're going to fly sans guest because of all the information that I have to give out. This is really one straight shot from beginning to end. So get your coffee, your tea, your favorite thing, because we're going to really go hardcore and we're going to go deep into the X mystery, and we're going to do it through the figure of Nikola Tesla. But before we get into all that, I wanted to start off. Of course, everyone knows that we've been deep into the Nixon time capsule story, which was brought forward on Dark Journalist for the first time on Valentine's Day. And that's Robert Merritt, who worked for Richard Nixon in the Houston plan. And he tells the story in the interview, which may be one of his last, that because of his ill health, that he wanted to get on the record, which was that Nixon had told him he put this time capsule with this incredible information that the scientists had got from Los Alamos into a time capsule now in the White House. And he had the location of it and offered the location to the National Archives. National Archives didn't take him up on the offer. And, you know, so this is the nature of this whole thing. But in the middle of all this, Snopes, who many of you may know as this kind of, you know, it's the go-to internet debunker for different things that are out there. So if you're CNN, you'll be like, let's check Snopes. And they've really become the go-to for the mainstream media, which is pretty laughable. But anyway, they took on the "Did President Nixon keep a time capsule in the White House?" question. And they decided to leave it as unproven instead of false, which I think is pretty significant, because I think they knew they were in some trouble with their information gathering on this one. But also what they did instead was they put words like absurd and preposterous into their whole setup of the article. But I think it's significant, and it shows the public interest rising in the question around the time capsule. And I think that's just an unstoppable force that at some point breaks the waves, because it's kind of hard to stop that many people picking up on something. And just by the very nature of it, and the possibility of the testimony from such a source who has the background, you know, somebody like Merritt, who was there during the Watergate era and was interviewed and interrogated by people like Archibald Cox and all that. I think it's one of those things which is going to be undeniable. So what we see in Snopes is they took the first shot. Now, let's remember that Snopes is helping Facebook right now in their anti-fake news campaign, which basically means whatever the establishment doesn't want has to be out. And we've seen it over and over again. And it's social media wide, actually. It's even here on YouTube, unfortunately. And we hope that our efforts aren't affected by it. But then, you know, it's, as I said, the work that we're putting out becomes an unstoppable force at a certain point. So even the social media platforms, you know, they're in a kind of a damned if we do, damned if we don't type of situation, because the leaning, you know, as I've recently seen Reddit do a lot of this crackdown too, it's tricky because they can always use the thing about like, oh, you know, we're stopping extremism. And on that note, before we get into our Trump Tesla time capsule, I wanted to point out something in Snopes, which they claim the reason they're helping Facebook and why they're so interested in stamping out fake news. And this is a quote from their website now. "We have been partnered with Facebook for more than a year," says Snopes, "working alongside other organizations around the world to fact-check corrosive fake news propaganda before it contributes further to ultraviolence, mass displacements, or destabilization on a global scale. Well, gee, who knew a video could do all that? That's kind of fascinating. One of the things I found interesting about them being partnered with Facebook is I started to look into their finances a little bit, and guess where they got a big grant from? The amazing Randy. And Randy, of course, being affiliated with PsyCop, and PsyCop being basically an arm of the CIA who send out a flock of people onto Wikipedia that something paranormal or relating to psychics or relating to UFOs goes up there. They send in all these people to write all of these things like, well, that's a hoax and all the rest of it. So Wikipedia becomes basically part of the junk culture. This is a very important effort on behalf of these people. And the fact that Randy is giving them money, I found interesting, especially since Randy's husband, who's 40 years his junior, is serving time for identity theft. So, it's very interesting when you get into these relations and who funds them and what's behind them. But Snopes stepped in it, and I think, if anything, by going after the time capsule story as they did here, they're going to generate more interest, and that's the kind of catch-22 situation they found themselves in. So it is Good Friday, and I do want to say to everyone who's celebrating that that's a wonderful time, and Easter is this Sunday, so I hope that it goes great. However people decide to celebrate the weekend, we know it's going to be a fantastic one. Now, some groundbreaking information tonight. In the X series, we've been following the steganography of the letter X, which has gone through all of these various phases. We've seen it in relation to the UFO technology. We've seen it coming out of Walter Dornberger's work, coming from Project Paperclip and going into our program. And particularly, I spotlight the X-15 in relation to that, which people like Philip Corso, who had worked in the Foreign Intelligence Office and for the Eisenhower administration, and was the guy who came forward and said, well, we redeveloped all this material and gave it out to corporate America. Certainly some truth to that. But one of the things I found interesting that he said about the X-15 was it was set up to do UFO recon. So they wanted something that was fast, and that is still the fastest plane because it was a space plane. And so they're just now approaching, they still hold records, even though they were from the 60s, which I find remarkable. But in any case, right off the bat, around this X-15 thing, as I was reading, if I can grab this without knocking everything over, I was reading, this is a fascinating book. It's President and UFOs, Secret History from FDR to Obama, which I highly recommend. It's Larry Holcomb. Really excellent. And Olivia, make a note about Larry Holcomb. Let's make sure we get him on the show. Mm-hmm. Just relating to the X-15 to give us a crossover and a tie over into Walter Dornberger's work and how important that X-15 was. He has a point here about Vandenberg Air Force Base. Quote, the report concerned Jean May, a Douglas test pilot who had been involved in an X-15 test flight, so the story goes. May had, as the story goes, May had taken the X-15 on a test flight some several years before, that would be 1962, with only 15 minutes of fuel on board. Yet May didn't land until 3 hours later. It's pretty unusual. When he landed, May reported that he had been taken on board a UFO, X-15 and all. Okay, so he's flying his craft. The ship actually picks up him and his craft. So he goes into it and checking the story. He found that Jean May was a Douglas test pilot, but he was trying to figure out exactly when he was flying this X-15. And he goes into it, and there's a number of things there. But what I think is fascinating is Corso and the story about the X-15 being set up gives us an idea that X-15 was kind of like, as Blue Gemini was, it was sort of a high point for doing this. And they were getting to the point where they could actually keep an eye on these craft and surveil them. Now, when we get through the 50s, we're looking at this kind of period where there's a vast number of programs because of crash retrievals, etc., to get advanced technology based on that kind of information, and also the information we were getting from the Nazi technology through paperclip and all the Bell technology and all the mystery of that period. And we've gone into how X really was formulated by Frank Scully, because when he went into the Aztec UFO crash, the FBI coined the X Files. And at the time, they had Guy Bannister, who would later show up around the JFK assassination. And Guy Bannister was an FBI agent whose job was, kind of like a Mulder thing. He was to go out and check out those FBI reports on UFOs. And in fact, he did. And there's newspaper clippings of him doing that, which is quite strange when you get into it. And I'll tell you, whenever you get into the JFK period, there's always, and I mean always, a strange aerospace NASA UFO aspect to it. So you're getting close to the UFO file in Kennedy because he's a lot like open, his whole goal is to open the government up, very much like Glasnost under Gorbachev. He's going into this openness, and there's just this kind of ironclad grip of the deep state around this technology. They do not want it out. And in fact, they win that battle. They're able to keep it, but with a few notable exceptions, as we'll see. So the X itself, let's just track it quickly and recap for people who haven't seen the other shows. So we have this Eisenhower time capsule, which was put in 1953, which is cited in a book, a biography of Eisenhower, and another book. One of them is by Evan Thomas, so it's clearly out there. And the time capsule is called Project X. Okay, that's a 100-year time capsule from 53, so we got 2053 there. Moving forward to the Merritt story, we have, again, Nixon telling Merritt about X, when he's describing the time capsule. It's Planet X this time. We have the LBJ letter, which I've shown on this program many times, which is in the LBJ library now and in their archives, and that doesn't come out till 2023. Again, we're looking at this XXX, the X-15, developed by Walter Dornberger. We can look at this steganography through history and see that it's a way of moving the this kind of remote technology, this exotic technology that they're getting, which is some kind of a hybrid between their redeveloping this UFO stuff and our own advances. And it's traveling around. It's very distinct in the way that it goes. So, but whenever we get close to it, these X's start showing up. And the X's in relation to the presidents often mean that they want to be the ones who are credited with doing something, either being the disclosure president or getting close to that level of, bringing it up a notch. And these letters somehow pertain to that. And I'm calling them stealth archives because they are out there. In many cases, we can see them, but we can't actually read them, which I find quite fascinating. And in the case of LBJ's letter, for example, it's 5 years from now that the full letter would be revealed. And the time capsule now comes up in a whole different way, because when we look at this larger picture, instead of taking it as just some person's story, and regardless of their history or whatever, there's actually a lot of information that supports this idea that Nixon was moving towards disclosure. We've gone into the Bob Emenegger documentary, which was UFOs Past, Present, and Future, and that was assisted and promoted by the Nixon administration and the DOD at the time. So it's 1971 and 72. This is when they're getting ready to do this, which I find fascinating. And we went into Blue Gemini in the last episode, so I won't go into it too much here, except to say that that was a program for UFO recon that got out of the hands of the people who were running the space program from NASA. And at a certain point, NASA gets infiltrated because these people want to get their hands back on the Blue Gemini program. And Blue Gemini is kind of another high mark there. The budget is very high for the period of time, and it's hidden. And when we look at Blue Gemini, what stands out for me the most is that we didn't get the records on it really till 2015. I find that pretty substantial, and that Robert McNamara, who was the defense secretary under JFK, goes on the record saying, what's going on here? Are we looking at two different national space programs? That's the first reference in print in a declassified document to the secret space program that we've ever seen. And I think it should be taken seriously and gone into what exactly is he referring to. And it's the Blue Gemini starts to become part of this breakaway aspect of the space program. And so they try to get it back, and what they do is just pull the plug on it. They're like, if we can't get our hands on it, we'll do it. And what Kennedy does, which I find very significant, is he forms the Defense Intelligence Agency, which is the DIA, different from the CIA, trying again to move the reins back from the CIA, which is this out-of-control outfit, which is pretty much running the world and running the show. And he gets in as president, and he's like, I can't control these guys, throw a net on them. But he's at loggerheads with them over and over again. Now, typical historians would say about JFK and the CIA, well, he had this battle, you know, they were anti-communists and he was a dove or whatever. And all those explanations are fine, but they're missing the single most important aspect of the battle, which is the UFO file. The UFO file was considered the biggest secret. So in the United States national security system, it had a higher rank than the atomic program. So they understood the value of that UFO file. It could be devastating if an enemy got it into their hands. So they were able to treat it on this level. However, because of that situation, they were able to abuse the secrecy and create this wall of secrecy. Now, if we go back further in time, we run into Nikola Tesla's work. And this is where things get really fascinating. We have to say a few things about Tesla first off, right off the bat. Coming over here, he had nothing. He always had an unusual background. He had certain mystical visions when he was a child. He was an incredible genius growing up. And he came over here with this one dream, which was to work for Edison, who was his big hero at the time in developing electricity and all the rest of it. His story is too lengthy to get into, but you know, just a synopsis generally. He comes here and he realizes that the people involved, like working for Edison, for example, that he gets cheated over and over again. He's coming up with ideas and they promise him things and he gets cut off over and over again. So he realizes that what we can do is create wireless energy. And these companies at first are excited about it, like Westinghouse and JP Morgan and all these other people. And then they realize, wait a minute, we're going to lose all this energy monopoly and the possibilities for it in the future. This is the period where Henry Ford's cars are coming out. And so they're sort of looking at this and saying, this is almost like a communist plot or something, free energy, forget it. And so they really cut off his work and therefore cut off our progress as a civilization by about 100 to 150 years right there, because when he's proposing this, we're looking at about 1903. So, you know, we're about 115 years later and we still don't have it. Now, of course, we adopted wireless and things like that, but you have all these things like internet ghettos and stuff when people have to pay for a certain amount to get in. So we really, I'd say we missed an opportunity there. But one of the things, of course, that Tesla brought on board, which is quite incredible, is that he developed alternating current. He's not often given credit for this, but everybody knows if you look at the historical record, it's absolutely true. And I think what's important when we look at that is that Edison, with alternating, with direct current, was doing all these things because direct current was a real pain in the neck because you had to carry all these generators and do this other stuff. The alternating current revolutionized. That's the electricity that we know today. So when we say who invented electricity, let's get down to it. It's really Tesla. And so we all know the story about Edison and that he executed an elephant to show how dangerous alternate current was, alternating current. So when we get into these different things, we can see the establishment was already very opposed to anything that he might have been up to. Now, something that I find fascinating about Tesla is that in 1899, he started to get these signals from space. And he wrote a press release to his scientific comrades and said, brethren, you know, we have this incredible contact from space. The message is 1.2.3. And he had eliminated all the different obstacles for what it could be. And it was direct communication from what he was set up with. So when we look at Tesla, he's already kind of moving into this idea that we can have contact with other worlds. He's moving into the idea of wireless technology, but he's moving into the idea of wireless energy, and that's where it gets cut off and really marginalized because it's really only in the past, say, 30 years or so that we even know more about Tesla. I was talking to someone and they were talking about this period of the 40s and 50s, and Tesla was really nobody knew anything about him at all. So we're just starting to kind of rediscover this incredibly important figure in history. One of the things when we start to look at Tesla is we start to get the impression that there's more than meets the eye here. And so by the 1940s, you know, he's been kind of marginalized in society through most of his life, and he's kept active and he's kept in the public eye. But one of the things I think that we've really missed in looking at his past is that he was marginalized and kept in this state little by little. When you aren't given the big projects and you aren't given the big money and all the rest of it, your creativity tends to dry up. Well, as it turns out, he was working on something that the press would coin the death ray by the time World War II hit. And he was like, you know, looking back at his countrymen being threatened by Hitler, and he's saying, I really have to get this to the president and all the rest. And they were still keeping him down and keeping him, you know, a close FBI watchful eye on everything that Tesla did. But what I think is interesting for us is that this imagery around the death ray is very important for us to keep in mind. And we're going to go back now a little bit and take a look at what were the developments around this death ray and who exactly was sent in to do cleanup once Tesla died. Now, I've said there's a bombshell, and there's actually a few in this episode, because in looking at all this, actually, many people know that Tesla and Trump have some kind of connection. That's not any news. The connection is that Trump's uncle, Dr. John Trump, went, and he was the man who had to play cleanup and go in. Now, there's a couple of interesting things to keep in mind about John Trump. We're going to get into them here. I have so much information on Pine Gap that we're going to also tackle in this episode. So far, so good. Okay. First of all, Trump's uncle and his X connection. Let's start with that. Worked on X-rays with Professor Vannevar. This is important because they developed the most powerful X-rays. And Nikola Tesla also, when we get into that situation with Tesla, he's one of the first people who did X-rays. He's not credited as the inventor of the X-ray, but he was already doing it in his lab. And had he had the time and the funding, he would have been known as the person who did it, because they have all those shots of him doing the X-rays in this period of time in the late 19th century. So there's this whole X-ray tie-in with Trump, John Trump, Tesla, and this Professor Vannevar, who Trump actually ran off and worked with and became his mentor. But before that, he had another mentor, which we're going to get into, which nobody has brought up yet, and it's going to blow this entire stack wide open. I promise you that. And it's not going to just take one show to blow it open either. We're going to have to really sift through this, but we're going to get the big one tonight. Okay, so upon his death in the hotel, and Tesla's death, this is 1943. Now we're in the throes of a war with Hitler. We're trying to really get fast, going into the nuclear program, get that bomb working, and we're starting to push back Hitler, and Hitler's starting to lose in Russia, and so on. So it's a good period of time, but Hitler's still a major threat, and we have the Japanese bombing Pearl Harbor 2 years previously, so we're in the throes of the major war. Now, the FBI breaks in to Tesla's hotel room upon his death, and they send for Dr. John Trump from MIT, who's the head of the MIT engineering school. That's also going to be quite important. MIT plays a big role in this. It's about 15 minutes in that direction from here. So Trump's uncle had a very interesting recollection, which nobody's picked up on yet. And it's something I found quite compelling. This is Trump's uncle now, John Trump. FBI agents said that this death ray had the ability to take flying objects down. This is interesting. I'm actually going to read the full quote here. Flying objects is the key word in there. This is still 1943. So you could have easily just said, well, it can knock a plane out of the sky. It had the ability to take flying objects down. This is going to become important. Okay, so Dr. John Trump was called in to review Tesla's papers. Quote, I was particularly looking for something which would be evidence of a secret weapon, which I was reminded by the two agents who were present during the entire time, was a matter of concern to the United States. It had the capability of acting at a great distance, of being destructive to flying objects and things of that kind. A place at a place that was remote from the source. This is very important. So you're saying that on one side of the world, people could be launching something could be going on. There could be a flying object coming in, let's say, to Virginia, and you could be somewhere in Alaska and press a button and this thing and knock it out. This is why the FBI wanted it. But the flying object aspect, I think, is crucial, because we're seeing that when you say death ray, it sounds just like, oh, you've got a big ray that's going to melt a continent or something, or take an army down. One of the interesting things I think we're looking at with Tesla's language here, and we have to really pay attention to the FBI's language when they're talking to Trump, is how did they get this information in the first place about the death ray? Well, Tesla had a tendency to talk to different people. And upon his death, and even before his death, the FBI was keeping a close eye on him and his associations, and he was saying things. But when the paper came out and said this thing about a death ray, he came out and debunked it and said, no, I said death beam. And I think that's a very telling sign also from Tesla, that he's looking at this situation and the word's getting out, and he's like, well, let's keep it real. It's beam. So whatever it is, it's some kind of beam technology, and it takes down flying objects. That's the crucial piece to remember. The quote from Trump, I think, is important too. And he also says, they didn't leave me alone for a second, the FBI people, when we went and investigated Trump's belongings, Tesla's belongings. This is Dr. John Trump, who lived in Watertown, Mass, interestingly enough. Very familiar to people like me who are from Cambridge. This is the FBI file for Tesla. You notice the X's on the top and the bottom. You can see these throughout Tesla's files. Interestingly enough, Muckrock, which is a very interesting site that goes around trying to solve these different types of historical puzzles or draw up government documents and all the rest of it, they did a FOIA request in 2017, and only a few days ago got a number of these responses. So we've got a lot of X imagery around Tesla, but I think the Trump-Tesla interface is what we're really looking for and looking at here. So we went through that Tesla revolutionized American industry. I think this is very important. JP Morgan tried to block them, try to block wireless energy. Now, Tesla, one thing I want to point out here is that one of the great inspirations that he would have, and he was kind of a mystic in this sense, is that when he was reading Goethe's Faust, that's how he got the inspiration for alternating current. And the quote that got him, actually, I took down here. I'm going to read it here. I'm reading more poetry tonight. Okay, so it is from Faust. The glow retreats, done is the day of toil. It yonder hastes, new fields of life exploring. Ah, no wing can lift me from the soil upon its track to follow soaring. And apparently it was the follow is how we got alternating current, because direct current, you get the current straight in. And when he was working on this energy motor and thinking of alternating current, it had a follow and follow. It goes round and round. And so this is something where he had that kind of epiphany in the park and drew the diagram in the dirt with a stick. So we can tell the kind of, state that he was in. It was an ecstatic state that he had arrived at. But we have to realize, even in situations like this, when we're dealing with people like Tesla, when you're dealing with things like the UFO file, and you're going to see Gene Dixon plays a huge role in all this. And I've tried to bring out the role of Gene Dixon here before. There's this aspect which is completely unknown to us, which has a place in our political process, in the governing process, and we don't get to see it because it's so well hidden. And it's been touched on at times when we've gotten into things like remote viewing, for example, when we find out about these things. Then things start to get interesting because we're like, so the government had a program for using psychics to get information. Fascinating. Gee, the government had psychics as advisors on incredible situations. So let's talk about Gene Dixon for a moment here. I brought her up in previous shows. So she had advised different presidents all the way from FDR, Truman, and all these different presidents on key situations. As a matter of fact, the more I looked into her entire past, which is remarkable, the more I realized she's probably the most powerful woman in history of her time in particular, because it was her readings and her psychic vision that were solving things like Middle East crises and war situations all the way back from FDR through Reagan. That's a pretty big slice of American history. And for her to be this kind of unacknowledged advisor because of what she was doing, I guess that's kind of the power of what she was doing. In a way, it's kind of like Rasputin's role without all the fanfare, but it is quite something when we look back at Dixon and the impact that she had. And I start to see when we get to this period of 1972 and we're looking at Nixon and what he's doing, putting up the Nixon pyramid, which creates all, it's an anti-ballistic missile facility, and it creates all this UFO activity. And when he's starting to gear up and get ready for disclosure, then we're looking at a whole different situation where Nixon is, the go-to person for Nixon is Dixon. And in fact, as these researchers found out, she had either called or showed up at the White House over 80 times in that period between 1968 and 1974 for Nixon. So that's a pretty incredible role that she had, and I still don't think we understand what was going on there. But someone did ask me, because I brought up previously, what was the link between her and Philip Corso, because I did say that they were close friends, and in fact, they were very close friends. But this person was trying to figure out how did they get together? And it turned out that Dixon was great friends with Strom Thurmond, who was a senator in the South, and he had a reputation. He ran for president. He's one of these. He had a kind of a view that wasn't so different from, say, like a George Wallace type guy. And nowadays we'd look back and say he was racist, but he came out of this environment. But he was definitely quite a powerful player, and eventually he came to come on board and say, like, these changes in our society are good and so on. But I would say this, that when we're looking at a guy like that, he's somebody who knows the Senate. He was there longer than any other senator, so we have to remember that. And he died at 100, still in the Senate. Just a remarkable history there, very unusual. And one of the things I think we need to keep in mind is that Dixon, cozying up to him, being close to him, understanding his political ambitions, well, who worked with him for 7 years? It was Corso. And as a matter of fact, he wrote the opening, originally, the foreword to Corso's book, saying how great Corso was. And then about 900 copies in, they realized it was about UFOs, and they were like, oh my God, get a lawyer on this and get him out of there. So Strom Thurmond, very, very tight there with Corso, and tight with Dixon, and Corso and Dixon being very tight, and Dixon being close with Nixon. What does all this mean? Well, we already knew that Nixon was very close to the UFO file, but the Corso aspect adds a dimension. But it is good for us to understand the lay of the land when we're looking at this. The way that it's portrayed, you would think that the psychic aspect or the UFO aspect is some fringe feature on the outside. The people inside are dealing with it, and they're working with it on a regular basis. And what we understand is that the UFO file is, in fact, the top secret of the national security state. So what we're talking about here goes right to the core of what is motivating them. And that's the thing that we need to find out in terms of global power, which is where are the motivations coming from? So the work that we're doing here, and that we're going to really blow some things wide open tonight, we're getting into that, you and I. We're starting to take a look at what's really happening, what their real motivations are. And we're not doing it in a frenzy. We're not doing it in a fear factory kind of manner. We're getting at it, and we're learning to understand it, and we're giving ourselves a chance to analyze the data. This is exactly my goal with the kind of information that we're bringing forward. Okay, so we're going to move on now. We've seen that Trump's uncle recovered the information. We've seen his unusual quote about flying objects. But one of the things that hasn't been apparent in history, and which I'm bringing forward tonight for the first time, at least, you know, for anyone who has looked, and it's on the record, but no one's brought it forward as of yet, which is that John Trump's mentor is Vannevar Bush. Now, if you understand the history around the UFO file, Vannevar Bush is quite a significant player. As a matter of fact, he's the only person in that whole MJ-12 picture who we actually have verification that he was involved with this. Vannevar Bush is also from Boston, like Trump was. He was the dean of MIT. He was an incredible power player. He started Raytheon. He has this just incredible background. And he was the dean of the MIT School of Engineering, the founder of Raytheon, the science advisor to Roosevelt, Truman, and Ike. So on the scientific side, he's the go-to man. And when you are dealing with the UFO file, the science part is number one, because if you don't understand the science, you're not getting anywhere. Which is why when all the UFO people saw Vannevar Bush in relation to MJ-12, everyone went through the roof about it, because they were studying it on that deep a level. They had their top guy in there. Now, a lot of people dispute the MJ-12 documents. That's fine, because what we have, and some people are familiar with Smith. He pops up in different ways. I'm sure everyone can see that. That's Wilbur Smith. And let's talk a little bit about Smith. He was a very kind of important figure in the Canadian government. But he was taken on board to do something called Project Magnet in 1950. And it was the Canadian government's version of our secret program to track UFOs and figure out what the heck's going on. So Smith, in a letter that was kept top secret until 1970, states that Vannevar Bush was in charge of the UFO study program. And so that dovetails nicely with all the MJ-12 information that's come out. But just to really lock that down, and I've been going back to Bill Steinman a lot lately, because Steinman wrote the book on the Aztec UFO crash with Wendell Stevens, and he was this incredible researcher, showed up on the scene, gave us these incredible interviews, nuggets of things, and then took off, basically, back into the woodwork to run his own life, which, you know, a lot of interesting scholars will do. They won't necessarily make a career out of it. But anyway, he was a very aggressive kind of researcher, and just the kind of guy we needed. So he wrote to a crucial participant in this program with Vannevar Bush. And let me just get the last one here. It's Dr. Robert Sarbacher. And this guy is one of the top physicists in the country. And now this is 30 years later that Steinman's writing to him saying, look, you know, there was this UFO program, and there was this group, and, you know, what were you guys doing, and what were your results? And then he doesn't get any answer, and he writes him another one and saying, oh, I guess it's still top secret. Sorry for bothering you so much. But in fact, he gets a letter back, and I'm going to read it verbatim, top to bottom. November 29th, 1983, to William Steinman. Dear Mr. Steinman, I'm sorry to have taken so long in answering your letters. However, I've moved my office and have had to make a number of extended trips. To answer your last question of your letter, October 14th, there's no particular reason I feel I shouldn't or couldn't answer any and all of your questions. I'm delighted to answer all of them to the best of my ability. Okay, this guy is assuming a kind of openness around the UFO topic that isn't there, but so far so good. You listed some of your questions in your letter of September 12th. I will attempt to answer them as you had listed them. Relating to my own experience regarding recovered flying saucers, I had no association with any of the people involved in the recovery and have no knowledge regarding the dates of the recoveries. If I had, I would have sent it to you. 2, regarding verification that persons you list were definitely involved. This is the important part. Dr. Vannevar Bush was definitely involved. And I think Dr. Robert Oppenheimer also. My association with the Research and Development Board under Dr. Compton during the Eisenhower administration was rather limited, so that although I had been invited to participate in several discussions associated with reported recoveries, this is of UFO material, I could not personally attend the meeting. I'm sure they would have listed Dr. von Braun, and the others that you listed were probably asked also, and may or may not have attended. This is all I know for sure. I did receive some official reports when I was in my office at the Pentagon, but all of these were left there at the time we were never supposed to take them out of the office. Well, tell that to Luis Elizondo, who just, videotapes appear out of the blue. This guy has more films than anybody, but apparently you can't take him out of the Pentagon. That's interesting. But back to the letter, something very interesting he closes the letter with, and this is the letter to Bill Steinman. It's absolutely official letter. It's on his letterhead, and Steinman put it in the record. About the only thing I remember at this time is that certain materials reported to have come from flying saucer crashes were extremely light and very tough. I'm sure our laboratories analyzed them very carefully. Of course, we got reports along this line very shortly after that. There were reports that instruments or people operating these machines were also of very light weight, sufficient to withstand the tremendous deceleration and acceleration associated with this machinery. I remember in talking with some of these people at my office that I got the impression these, quote, aliens, this is one of the top physicists in the country, quote, aliens, were constructed like certain insects we have observed on Earth, wherein because of the low mass, the inertial forces involved in operation of these instruments would be quite low. I still do not know why the high order of classification has been given and why the denial of the existence of these devices. I'm sorry it has taken me so long to reply, but I suggest you get in touch with the others who may be more directly involved in this program. Sincerely yours, Dr. Robert I. Sarbarker. It occurs to me that Bush's name is incorrect. As you have it, please correct the spelling. And in fact, he was right. He was missing a letter. So you can see Sarbarker didn't miss any little detail. And he is saying, without a doubt, that Vannevar Bush was in charge of this UFO research program for the government. It's not an MJ-12 thing. This is Sarbarker saying it on the record himself. Of course, in MJ-12, you have all that information about Vannevar Bush. So let's go to Wilbur Smith here just for a moment. So he talked to the American physicist Sarbarker, which is why Steinman talked to him in the first place, back in the 50s. And there's a 3-page memo there where he talks about it. And let's see if I can get to the key passage here. I, Wilbur Smith, made discreet inquiries through the Canadian Embassy staff in Washington who were able to obtain for me the following information. The matter relating to UFOs, the matter is the most highly classified subject in the United States government, rating higher even than the H-bomb. 2, flying saucers exist. 3, their modus operandi is unknown, but concentrated effort is being made by a small group headed by Dr. Vannevar Bush. So Vannevar Bush now shows up the top physicist in history, and here 30 years earlier, Wilbur Smith is saying, again, through American physicist Sarbarker, he got this information. So 33 years later, Sarbarker was telling the same story he told to Wilbur Smith 30 years earlier. And there are these guys who work on this stuff who are scientists who really don't understand the level of secrecy. They might understand that it's secret, but certainly on this level. So it looks like Sarbarker was the president and chairman of the board of the Washington Institute of Technology, oceanographic and physical scientists, a real hardcore player. And the interesting thing about Smith's documents, Wilbur Smith, out of the Canadian government, it's some of the most honest talk about UFOs that you get, because it wasn't under that extreme clampdown that we have when dealing with the wall of secrecy here in the United States. Now, so we have now, without a doubt, the top, basically the top scientist in the government, one of the top, Vannevar Bush, studying UFOs. He is Trump's mentor at MIT. There's an Australian documentary and a series of documentaries and talks by Trump, and I've viewed them all now. It's 6 hours of material of him talking about every different aspect of his life. And he talks about how they're asking him, well, how did you get involved with X-rays? All your work was defense related. And he said, well, the X-rays were defense related too. It related to space. And they did all these different incredible things. Now, they said, well, how did you get to work with Van de Graaff? And Van de Graaff was one of these very famous scientists working with X-rays at this period of time we're talking about in the 30s. And he said, well, it was my mentor at MIT, Vannevar Bush, who said you have to go and work with him. Now, what I find fascinating about this is, you know, we've been following this X and the track of the X, but, you know, what we have with Vannevar Bush being Trump's mentor, so he basically is aware of the UFO file and the UFO factor, because Vannevar Bush is the lead man on it. So, you know, obviously his understudy is certainly going to know. I think that's important, one. But what's also important for us to consider, and is absolutely devastating, is the family tie-in now. And how everything else is going to make a whole lot more sense by the end of this broadcast. We're all going to leave with our jaws on the floor. We're starting already with Vannevar Bush to get this impression of, oh, okay, Vannevar Bush, the head of MJ-12, the head of the Special Studies Project around UFO redevelopment. And as we know from something else that Steinman got from working with Eric Wang's widow, that Henry Kissinger was the Rockefeller's man on the Special Studies group studying redevelopment of UFOs. And so we have really these top people moving around this topic, and they're moving the UFO file along in this period of time, in the 50s. So now let's go into Vannevar Bush and Trump and see what we come up with. Let's get a few facts on the record here. Vannevar Bush, the dean of MIT School, a school of engineering, and he's the founder of Raytheon. He certainly was a Pentagon favorite and was present at the Trinity atomic tests. So just, you know, you can't have a more inside guy than that, except maybe for Oppenheimer, who the establishment disowned pretty rapidly, because he had extreme misgivings about the atomic program, as we found out. One thing I do want to point out here is that Wilbur Smith, being the head of Project Magnet, so he's getting this information to us. It's an incredibly unsullied source. We don't have to worry, is it the Byrne memo? Is it something that somebody got? It's just a fact of history. So we know that Bush was in charge of the UFO program. It's on the record. Now let's fast forward to the Nixon time capsule for a moment. Merritt says that Nixon left a time capsule in the White House containing a formula for energy independence that they had got from working through scientists at Los Alamos with this being that they had under their protection, is the way that Nixon put it to him. Now, I'm going to go into the Gene Nixon thing. Nixon predicts somehow in this letter to Trump that Trump is going to be the president. 1987 is when he sends the letter. I've shown the letter here many times. And as you can imagine, I'm happy to show it again. But I do think it's important because it establishes the links in reality, and we're not reaching for them. They are facts we can get our hands on. By the way, that, of course, is Nikola Tesla, who started so much of this conversation so far. And we're going to get deeper into that. This is Vannevar Bush, and he is there with the president of Harvard and Harry Truman. So that is Bush over here, but incredible high-level player in 3 administrations: FDR, Truman, and Eisenhower. Just absolute nonstop, and the lead man on the science side for the UFO file, which is absolutely, that's what we're here talking about, really, when you get right down to it. One of the interesting things, I think, when we look at the Merritt situation and what he's talking about with the time capsule, and then we draw the whole thing back to Nixon. So Nixon moves in the 80s to New York, of all places. Nixon, who's the big West Coast guy, always lived in California or Washington. Suddenly he's in New York, which, of course, Donald Trump has his headquarters there. But he's in New York full time. Writes this letter: "Dear Donald, you should run for president. You'll be a winner." And he's saying Pat predicted it, his wife, Pat Nixon. But let's think about predictions for a minute and think about Jeane Dixon for a moment. Jeane Dixon, probably with her close relationship with Nixon, made these, many predictions. Why is he making predictions? Let's think about it. It makes more sense that Jeane Dixon made the prediction. That's where I'm going to go out on a limb and just say that's something I think. She made the prediction: this guy's going to be president. Get close to him, and you can do your second wave of disclosure through him, through this figure. So let's think about a few odd things to start with. We've got Nixon and Trump striking up a relationship in the 80s. I think that's significant. It's crucial when you're really looking at this. We have the letter Nixon writes to him. We have Nixon moving to New York. We have Trump flying him around on a private plane to different things. They went to a fundraiser for former Governor John Connally, who had once been the Treasury Secretary under Nixon. And he was in the car, of course, when JFK was assassinated. There's all this imagery around Trump and Nixon. So what was the nature of the relationship there? Well, even in USA Today, when they're saying Nixon letter to be hung in Oval Office, that letter that Nixon wrote to Trump telling him to run for office now hangs in the White House. It's in the Oval Office, so he sees it every day. How significant was that letter and Nixon's relationship to Trump? Absolutely crucial. Just think, what kind of a letter would you put up on your wall if you became president? Or even if you just became, president of your own company? Putting that letter on the wall tells us that Nixon is a key, crucial figure to Trump. We've got pictures of them together. We know of the relationship. But now let's talk about it a little bit deeper. Now that we know John Trump had this incredible mentor, Vannevar Bush, who was the science man in charge of the UFO file. The uncle knew. So the uncle, part of the family trust. The uncle passes that information along to Trump. Trump understands it. When he connects with Nixon, Nixon was the original disclosure president, 1972. Watergate destroys that. He puts a time capsule in there. Trump's in the White House now through incredible circumstances he got in. Well, let's face it. So let's just keep all that in mind, and keep all that in mind when we think that when Nixon says, I am predicting, or Pat says you're going to be president, we predict you're going to be president. What's going on there is he's getting a prediction from somewhere. And my suspicion is, again, it's Dixon working behind the scenes as someone I think is the most powerful woman till about Maggie Thatcher, somewhere in there. So Nixon moves to New York City as close to Trump. When Trump becomes president, he places the Nixon letter in the Oval Office. I just got into that. Now, the question out of all this is, did Nixon tell Trump about the time capsule, or did he realize it would leave Trump vulnerable? Did he instead leave information that would cause Trump to look? You see how important this question becomes. He had that close relationship. He thought, did he trust him enough to say, well, you understand the UFO file. Your uncle is John Trump. Vannevar Bush is the guy that I worked with in the CIA version of Blue Book. So here is the UFO file. Now, he may have trusted him enough to say that, but did he give him the time capsule message? Did he tell him where it was, or was that going to be a burden on him? Was that going to cause a problem for someone like Trump? And was Nixon just going to kind of keep an eye on the circumstance and see if Trump rose before he did that? That is all up to question, and it's up to fate. But what I think is absolutely essential, and which has not been on the record, is that Trump's uncle, his mentor, Vannevar Bush, was in charge of the UFO file, which means Trump's knowledge of the UFO file is through the roof, which means these attempts to go around truth and go around Trump with things like Podesta's role in the To the Stars Academy and all this nonsense that they're pulling. And when Trump says, I'm opening the Space Council, it means that he's coming from a much more grounded place, that he knows a lot more than these people give him credit for. And I couldn't find anything on the record anywhere about Bush being the mentor to John Trump until I found it myself. So, those people are probably underestimating his knowledge of the UFO file, or it could be the first thing that infuriated them with him trying to get into the White House, is that his chances as president of recovering the UFO file from the groups that had taken it out of the umbrella of the presidency under the Eisenhower administration, now the chances are a lot better that the presidential level will get their hands back on that technology. And let me tell you, if it is in fact the biggest secret of the national security state in the United States, well, that's a pretty big battle. That's why you would throw your major CIA people out there with flimsy Russian charges to get rid of Trump as fast as you can, and to Nixon him. Because remember, the other person that they took out really fast was Gough Whitlam, who was the Australian Prime Minister in 1975, who was a popular guy from the other end of the spectrum. He was kind of like more like a Bernie Sanders type. He had universal health care and you don't pay for college and all that. And he was doing great. The only problem with him was he wanted to boot the Americans out of Pine Gap. So they made up a phony charge and they dismissed him. And the role of Queen Elizabeth in that is huge, and that's coming out more and more. So this group, when it moves to get people out of the way, it doesn't matter if they're a president. If we can go all the way back to the John F. Kennedy assassination, when they move, they have to come out on the winning side. There can be no doubt about it. So I think we're looking at something very significant there. Before I get into the heavy-duty finale on this, I'm going to double back for a moment to Pine Gap, because one of the very interesting things I kept trying to do was find these different code names for Pine Gap, which is the facility in Australia, which is the largest listening station. That is, this is where the NSA listens in on foreign leaders and all the rest of it. Of course, even that is a cover, because one of its main functions is the redevelopment of the UFO technology. So let's just do this little foray to wrap up some of the information that we had about Pine Gap in the last episode. And how are we doing over there, Olivia? Great. Okay, super. I guess it's a good time also to put your questions up, because we'll be taking questions as we get to the end of the show here, and we'll make some serious time for that. Again, it's great to have everyone here. You are watching the Dark Journalist show, and we're really breaking into territory now with this, which is going to change the shape of how we look at the entire question. And, we're not going to be worrying about Anunnaki or side issues about, is that a UFO and that Navy footage from Luis Elizondo, whatever. This goes all the way down the field. And I don't mind saying that because it's done that for me. And it's somebody who, you know, when I look at information, it takes a lot to tell me we're moving into a new paradigm on something. This information will get us into a totally new paradigm of how to look at this. Okay, so one of the code names for Pine Gap is Marino. And it's very interesting. This is a kind of sheep. So I found that's interesting. It turns out that there are 4 strands and 4 hybrid types that make up this incredible breed, and that they originally bred in Africa and they were sold into Spain, and now they actually have them in parts of Australia. But I could not for the life of me figure out why they would be referring to hybrid strains, you know, as an intelligence name, what the CIA would call Pine Gap. It didn't make any sense to me. And then when you study the UFO file in relation to Pine Gap, it starts to become clear, which is the technology that they are redeveloping at Pine Gap. One, they're redeveloping with the best of American ingenuity and know-how on our spacecraft, such as what we got working through the X system and all those X planes, and we're still working on X planes. So they're hybridizing those. That would make perfect sense because, you know, what's incredible about these ram sheep, when we shear them, we get incredible amounts of resources. You know, you're getting some of the best, which is why they're so incredible. So it's kind of like a shearing factory there at Pine Gap for the UFO file. They are going in and they are working with these different strands. Now, I have to point out, because someone will jump ahead of me and say it, which is when you're dealing with a code name that refers to hybrids, and you're talking about a major secret facility operating out of Australia, which holds the, in my opinion, the wealth of the UFO file, and it's completely dominated by America, even though it's on Australian soil. And 2 prime ministers in Australia who were opposed to it. One died under mysterious circumstances. The body was never found. And by the way, for those who, you know, Prime Minister Holt, when he disappeared and there was no body found, and they were like, oh, it's really, you know, unusual, no body found. Well, it turns out with no body found, there can be no inquest into the reason or cause of death. And so therefore, the entire matter gets dropped. There's no investigation. It's just has to be ruled an accident. And that's it. He's out of there. He opposed them and he's gone. I think that just like with Nixon, by the time you get into the 70s era, the CIA and that intelligence deep state structure, shooting leaders straight up when they're under investigation themselves is too much. You know, it's going to be a straight up war. So what they do instead is they force him out of office with a trick engineered by Queen Elizabeth. So very unusual circumstances. But I think that we have to keep this in mind when we're thinking of Pine Gap, that for all the unusual things about Prospero and the Shakespearean names about the base and, you know, the aerial spirit of the air that Prospero releases in the Shakespeare play, and how the name Pine Gap came from the Tempest, for its intelligence name to be Marino or Marino. Maybe someone in Australia can tell me how that's pronounced. Merino. Well, I think that we're getting to the cause and the core of what the base is for in that. We're getting very close. Now, the only reason we have that name is because Snowden released those documents. If he hadn't released the documents, we wouldn't have the code name. So again, it's a stealth archive. It's something that we wouldn't have had. Just like the Delshau material that we've talked about with Walter Bosley, which is what really is going to take us into some territory tonight. Okay, so we're following the X. You and I are deep in X-land now. And I'm going to just run through a couple of quick things here. And, you know, I'm not going to use like a PowerPoint or a slide thing because I think it's important. We do that in our video podcast and in our interview series. We have some of the best graphics, and I'll work on those. But here we're having this conversation, and it has to be more like a visceral conversation between you and I. So I'm going to show these to you, and let's see how well we do. That is the Nixon letter to Donald Trump. So it's on the record. The National Archives has it. There's no doubting it. Let's go back into Nixon and Trump for a moment. There is Trump and Nixon with John Connolly, who was in the car, as I pointed out in the previous episode. So we've got the time capsule, and we have the close relationship with Trump and Nixon. But when we look at Trump and Tesla, and them sending, of all people, John Trump, who was the protege of Vannevar Bush, to go investigate Tesla's work, we're getting a real picture of who the deep operators are and the levels of knowledge that they have. You're not going to send an average Joe, a regular scientist guy, to check Tesla's papers if you're the FBI. You're going to send the best guy that you have who understands what? Things that relate to the UFO file technology. That advanced degree has to be there. Otherwise, there's no reason to call this guy up and send him over. They could get anybody. The fact that he's Vannevar Bush's protege makes him the top candidate. As a matter of fact, they probably asked Vannevar Bush, are you going to do this? And he probably said, no, just send Trump over there. So we have to understand the level that John Trump is coming from. He's a major player, and, you know, his background working with x-rays and, you know, doing these advances, and he had his own electrical company, and he, you know, certainly had a respectable background. But there is no way that we understand him on the level that he should be understood. And once we do, we'll understand his nephew a whole heck of a lot better also, in my opinion. We have to get to something crucial about his nephew here. So there's 2 or 3 different places we could go from here, but I'm going to go right to it. Now, we had Walter Bosley on last week talking about the Sonora Aero Club. And Bosley has done the significant work around these early groups that had come from Europe and had been deeply involved. They were German, and they were deeply involved in the early development of flying machines. But they were way before the Wright brothers. As a matter of fact, the way he tracks them back, very likely they were associated with a secret society. And the group that Delshow associates them with is NIMZA, which is this acronym NYNMZA. And it took a long time for anyone to figure out what that was. And Bosley was the one who cracked the code of what was going on there. So there's a hardcore code embedded in Delshaw's work, and we did get into it. I recommend everyone watch the episode from last week, because it is the X equals O diagram and that whole chain of things. But tonight, we're going to get into some very unusual territory with Delshow, which is going to make the connections now with John Trump, President Donald Trump, and this early space program clear. And when we see Vannevar Bush in the middle of it, we're tracking right in the heart of the UFO file. And the X is our guide, is the kind of steganography of how this thing can move in a stealth fashion through these different departments of government and time and administrations without really getting out to the public, because it's a hard thing to do. It's very hard to pull off. And trust me, these people are experts, and I mean beyond experts at it. So I want you to take a look at a couple of these plates. These are Delshow plates, and they are flying machines. But you're going to notice something very interesting about one. I'm not going to ask you to look at it here. I've got a better shot. And this is something that came right out of Bosley's work on this. take a good look right in the heart. I'm going to point it out here. Right there. That says Trump. Now, let's recap Delshau real quickly. Delshau makes these incredible paintings, woodcuts, and all the rest of it, which all refer to these very unusual airships from this period. We're talking that Wright brother kind of period. But these go back even further. Now, he's this German who's come over and is associated with the Sonora Aero Club that Walter Bosley writes about. So his paintings end up in this attic somewhere and actually almost get burned up. So again, as far as a stealth archive goes, we're really lucky to have these, because these could have been burned and that would have been the end of it. No Delshau, no understanding of the Sonora Aero Group, nothing. Now, there are people in the 80s who discovered, actually in the 70s originally, but really got into it in the 80s, discovered Delshau, and there's a museum that puts his works up and all the rest of it. But this series that I just showed you is the 4500 series. Trump is the 45th president of the United States. John Trump is the person who was tasked with going through Tesla's information, because that's how high the federal government had him in regard. And he was Vannevar Bush's protege, and Vannevar Bush was in charge of the science, of the scientific developments around the Ufo file. I mean, that's all historical fact. None of us have to guess at that. Now we know it's all true. But when we look at this, I'm going to show it to you one more time. And that's Trump there, T-R-U-M-P. It's embedded in the 4500 series of Delshau. Now, instead of just looking at this as a straight up spooky thing, and again, we're looking at it on a steganography level, which is somebody maybe, there are ways and means of finding out why Delshau was writing about Trump. There were people deep inside of the secret societies whose name were Trump. One of them was Homer Trump, I believe. And then, there are all these external possibilities. Well, that family could have been associated with the Trumps and all that. I'm going to keep all that clear out of it. The only thing that matters is Delshau, and that's D-E-L-L-S-C-H-A-U. He's a very important German artist who left this information behind. By the way, after the artwork survived the incredible, that it was going to be just blown away in this fire, then it was sent to the junkyard, and an antique dealer had to rescue it. So I don't think we got to the truth about the Delshau work. Bosley says that there were other authors who got to it before him, but I actually recommend his work, because when you get into the Aero Club and the Delshau work, Bosley's really done the yeoman's work on that, and it's important because we understand that when we're dealing with the UFO file, we're looking at something that is in the realm of the 40s and beyond, but the earlier programs around this and the way that the technology was transferred down through mystery schools, etc., is something that's very hard to get a handle on. But why is Delshau showing us Trump around these flying machines at the turn of the century? Why is Vannevar Bush adopting Trump's uncle, John Trump? And why is Trump the 18th president that Richard Nixon is predicting will be in there? And what are we looking at with the possibilities of the time capsule coming forward with Trump in office? We're in a totally different paradigm now. Now we're into a different world because this information has come together. We can track the X, and that will help us get into these various programs, and that's what we've been doing. But crucially and essentially, what on earth is Trump, the name, doing on these Delshau plates? Something that we weren't even really supposed to have. So it represents something that you could say is directly out of a mystery school. We're in an unusual place right now. When we really have cracked a code that has been sitting out there and eluding us because as researchers, we've gone in for different areas, but it's because the researchers have gone so deep in and figured out things like Vannevar Bush, for example, that when Vannevar Bush shows up as Trump's mentor, we understand him. So all of these efforts and all these things are coming together now. It's a different paradigm. So I'm going to read you here. I have this whole section on Elon Musk, but I swear I still, the Trump part is so much more crucial in a way, and all these aspects are important. But here's the summary. I laid it out, and I want to really read this to you, and I want you to keep it in mind. And then we're going to take questions. And again, it's great to have everyone here. You're here with me, Dark Journalist, and I'm having a great time speaking with you about these discoveries. It's great to have Olivia out there working with everybody and making sure everything goes well, as she always does. Thank you, Olivia. How are you doing over there?
Great. Can you address something right away?
Sure.
So everyone wants to know why you're not doing Super Chat. I have answered that, but why don't you address it yourself?
Yeah, isn't it? Well, Super Chat's one of those interesting ideas where people can pledge to you and support you when you do the chat, which is a nice idea. Interestingly enough, the way they have it set up now is that Google and YouTube take a big chunk of the Super Chat if you do that, so that people who are trying to directly support the work that you're doing, they're, actually YouTube's taking a big bite of it. I don't mind the idea. I think it's a great idea, and I would love to have more support from it. What I recommend people do to support the Dark Journalist show is subscribe. What is it, $4 a month? And that's the really hardcore support. You can go right to the Dark Journalist site at darkjournalist.com and support the show. It's a better, clearer way without us enriching Google and YouTube. And I'm happy to enrich them by giving them all these viewers, but I don't think we should be giving them money straight up. And I know a lot of people are using it, and I salute them, because I know when you're doing this work, having that support and people stepping up to the plate is important. And it helps things go better, because things get expensive when you do this work too. So we do have to take a look at what the different options are out there. It's just like that with Patreon too. I say, what? Patreon is nice and all the rest of it, but really directly, if you subscribe to the Dark Journalist show, that's the best way you can support us. And you get a year's worth of shows, and shows that are before the public, and you get the really hardcore key stuff as it comes up and when it comes up. So, and we're going to do more for subscribers too. But thanks for asking that, because I guess my fundamental reason is it's more of a commercial move, and I understand why they would do it and why people would do it. But I think it's there are more direct ways to support something like the material that we do at darkjournalist.com, and I appreciate it. It makes a big difference. And I always say, get behind the things that you think are delivering value for you. That's what I do. I've gotten rid of things that don't deliver value. I'm getting behind the things that are making a difference, and I'm supporting them, So I would recommend you do the same thing here with us at Dark Journalist, because there's a lot of things we're going to be involved in this year, and we're going to deliver you the best information first. So what else you got?
Oh, do you want to go straight into questions?
No, but you said you had.
No, that was
okay. Okay, so what we'll do is I'll go into the summary here, and then we will we'll get right into it with the questions. And it's great. It's great to have everyone here. I see some great subscribers. A cult fan is here. That's always great to see. Christine Taggart. And it is great to see some of those people out there who are hardcore and really are following.
It's a fantastic chat tonight. There are no trolls. It's great.
How did we do it? We had like Mercury problems last week.
Yeah, I know. And now we're really in Mercury retrograde, so it doesn't make any sense, but it's great tonight.
Well, we've got that incredible weekend happening here. Okay. So let's just summarize here what we've just learned. Trump's uncle was a major insider. He was Vannevar Bush's protege from MIT. stone's throw from here. Vannevar Bush handled the UFO file from the science side. Trump was called in to recover Tesla UFO targeting research, which they called the death ray. But actually, interestingly enough, as we pointed out in an interview, John Trump said, well, they said it had the ability to take down flying objects at a great distance from a remote location. Did this cause some of the early UFO crashes? Let's think about that. The UFO file moved into the space program under Blue Gemini, and then ultimately it moved on the run to Pine Gap outside of the prying hands of people like JFK, although JFK was assassinated by the time Pine Gap got in there. Nixon, according to my interview with Merritt, deciphered this energy independence code through the Los Alamos scientists communicating with this being. And there was an energy independence aspect to this. And I have this, actually. I'm going to point this out. I showed it last week, but it kind of got lost in the shuffle. This one's incredible. This is an article. First of all, let's all remember what we're talking about with Pine Gap. There it is. Behold, a marvel in the darkness. This is very tricky. I'm trying to get a clear shot of this, but it says Pine Gap does scientific research for Tricky Dick. This is The Nation in Australia in 1975. And the article was written by, that we can make out, it's William H. Martin. Turns out that was a pseudonym. It's a long story. But in any case, they say in this article that Nixon, this is from 1974, before Watergate takes him out. It says that Nixon is going to announce that they have this new energy source and Pine Gap developed it. And that they're going to use this now instead, and it's going to revolutionize the world. This is where they were moving toward under Nixon. This is where we got things like Nixon's Pyramid. This is where we had the Robert Emmenegger UFO documentary, the Department of Defense getting behind this. I would not be surprised that in addition to a host of other reasons, again, the UFO file plays havoc with the American presidency. And I think it's absolutely crucial that Nixon was this close. And what's funny is when you go through the really good researchers like Stanton Friedman, or I cited him earlier, Larry Holcomb, and you ask them, Grant Cameron, they all feel that Nixon was right on the brink of being the UFO disclosure president. Who knew? Who even talked about Nixon in this regard? Really, until the time capsule question came up, I never even had seen that once. So I think we're in a strange place there in relation to this information. All right, let's finish our summary. Okay, so the UFO file moved to Pine Gap, and Pine Gap came out of this kind of Shakespearean, they had the Prospero base, the Prospero satellite, which got launched in 1971, was immediately had problems and they couldn't control it anymore, and it's still out there for 100 years, sending messages here and there. They just communicated with it in 2013, oddly enough. So something very unusual going on there. So Nixon decided to move the world towards the announcement with the Emmenegger UFO documentary. Of course, the footage of the UFO got pulled, and the documentary came out in this weird fashion where it had like Burgess Meredith, the Rocky guy, and you know, Rod Serling, and like different voices hosting over it. It really became a very strange mishmash. Pine Gap is part of the re-engineering of the UFO file. Merino, the code name for Pine Gap, is this very unusual rare breed of sheep that has 4 strains, and he's a hybrid sheep, and he, you know, you get more resources from that sheep than any other. And the history goes all the way back from Africa, selling them to Spain, and now they have them in Australia. But choosing them as the name when you're dealing with UFO exotic technology being redeveloped at a base gives us some idea. Now, remember, again, that's kind of a stealth archive because we wouldn't have had that without the information from Snowden. And of course, what was the program that Snowden and Glenn Greenwald uncovered, and this would be of interest to all the people who are just looking at this politically and forget about the UFO part, who just want to know about the deep state, like the intercept type of audience. They called it X key score. An X key score could dime in on any phone call, any email, anybody, anywhere, at any time. That's how powerful that was. How did that base get to be so powerful? I mean, there are protesters every year, and there are people in court cases facing jail time for trying to get into that base and protest it. I mean, it's a pretty significant situation, I'd say, between the U.S. and Australia on that. Okay, let's keep going. Nixon and Whitlam are thrown out of office by the deep state within a year of each other. I think that's significant. There's a Pine Gap tie-in here. Whitlam goes out under extraordinary circumstances. And really, when you get right down to it, so did Nixon. Because, of course, Nixon did a range of things. But let's face it, I mean, LBJ had done probably a lot worse. And we know that LBJ had very close associations with the CIA moves around the JFK assassination and, through a series of different books that have done the really hardcore research. We know that figures like Henry Marshall in the agricultural department, that they were assassinated because they knew too much about LBJ. Interesting thing about LBJ, and I won't keep going on about him because we can get into a lot of different things, but LBJ is significant. All of the different biographers and researchers who do this incredibly painstaking job never mentioned Billy Celestes, who is the crucial figure who said, yes, he's the one who was silent partners with LBJ and went to prison for years and years, and then came out and said he wanted to give testimony about all these murders that LBJ had ordered, including JFK. So, Robert Cairo and all that, if you think you're getting a good biography and he doesn't mention Billy Celestes, it's kind of a problem. So, Doris Kearns Goodwin, who is someone who does these Kennedy documentaries on PBS and stuff, well, she was LBJ's lover at the end of his life. How objective is she going to be? Shouldn't she sit up there and have a little thing that says, by the way, disclaimer, she was his lover? I mean, everyone knows that. It's not like a conspiracy theory. She had this extramarital affair with him. So, it's a problem. I think the mainstream really blew it and on these things. And that's why they are in this position where they have to try to stamp out the independent media, because the independent media has brought the facts to the table, not always in the most clear fashion or whatever, but it's been very helpful, I think, to have that contrast. And the smackdown coming from above, trying to take the hammer and smash the independent media, is reaching right down to change the narrative into shows that, like this one, or whatever it happens to be, Forbidden Knowledge TV, whoever, they will try to limit people's access to that type of information. And they'll use any kind of excuse. Okay, back to the summary. Nixon leaves the time capsule, so he's the disclosure president. This is the fundamental understanding that we arrive at from my interviews, from my work around the time capsule, from the X factor and all the rest of it. As I said, there's so much supporting apparatus, supporting information, extensions, extrapolations around that information, that the time capsule story doesn't have to stand on its own. Will you take the word of this guy who was a federal informant who talked about this? You can go much deeper than just that. Okay. With the help of psychic Gene Dixon, a friend of Philip Corso, who managed the Ufo File, this is my conclusion. Nixon realizes Trump will be president because of Gene Dixon. He writes him and says, run for president, you're going to win. And he moves to New York City. They become close. It's a fact. Trump flies him around to different benefits, etc. Trump, whose uncle is president, has connections to the Sonora Aero Club. That is in the Del Shell's work. They say the name right in the middle of the 4,500 plates. It doesn't get any more obvious than that. Trump reopens the Space Council. Now he is hearing about the time capsule. Okay. we're putting those pieces together. So that's where we are. And we've broken through some of the steganography that's been left behind. I have tons of material around this, but I think it's important for us to just grasp these main points that we've just summarized. The most important thing to keep in mind, I'd say, in addition, let me grab this one. Our friend here, Vannevar Bush, with Truman, all the power was coming out of Boston at the time. So MIT, Vannevar Bush, John Trump, JFK, Howard Menzel, Harvard Astronomy. It's all Boston. And Boston was the major core center. So that's an interesting thing for us to consider with the development of the UFO file into these different bases and branching off and the CIA taking control, which is the scientific community seemed to have the upper hand in the early stages, working with the military, yes. But then midway through the Cold War period of Eisenhower's administration, Eisenhower has the stroke. Nixon takes over and is inexperienced. They move the UFO file out of his reach. There's that incredible speech that, the information we got from Cooper, who was a whistleblower, Linda Moulton Howe, who had incredible information, who said that he met with Nixon and Eisenhower in 58, and Eisenhower said, at Area 51, the CIA won't give me updates, send back a message, which is, I'm going to invade it with the 8th Army tomorrow if they don't send me that information. So they were in his office and they gave him the briefing, and then they took Cooper and they showed him the different wreckage from these different assignments on the different crashes and things that happened. The letter that I read earlier from Robert Sarbarker is significant because he's just saying, oh yeah, Vannevar Bush was in charge of that UFO program, and we have Vannevar Bush being Trump's mentor. Those are the links that we need. This is the way that this information moves. When we arrive at that point, we're in a different space relating to understanding where the UFO file went. So when we see these little, kind of drippy things about, hey, Fox News wants to talk about how UFOs are a threat all of a sudden, and it's special guest Luis Elizondo. Luis Elizondo is counterintelligence, i.e. good at lying. These are not the people, the CIA are not the people we want to present the UFO truth. His boss was the drone king, who was John Brennan. And, their big kick was to drone people who were celebrating weddings and things like that. This is not the type of figure. And suddenly John Brennan's interested in UFOs, and he's like, we need to study this more. When those guys get involved and they start talking about threats and all the rest of it, you're in trouble. So that whole wing of it, remember, reject the CIA incursion into the UFO field wholeheartedly when you see, researchers who've been on the top of their game previously exposing this kind of things. And I've pointed out people like George Knapp, who I have great respect for because he's done so well for so many years. And they just give these CIA people a free ride through, people like Elizondo talking about how they have this information for the public and they're going to disclose UFO stuff. Don't believe the hype. The thing is, we have the track of it actually from our level, and you don't need the, Clinton era people coming in like Mellon and trying to tell us what UFOs are all about. We can follow the track because we've had the great researchers on the ground for 7 decades. And right now we have some of the best people out there available. There's not many of them. And most of the field is surrounded by psyops on one hand from the intelligence side, and by marketing ops coming in to basically harvest people's interest in money and take attention away from the really crucial stuff. I say that we make the movement, about getting behind the good information, supporting the good information, getting in there with Solari.com, Catherine Austin Fitz work. It's an education. It's like a university. Joseph Farrell, the people we've had on this program. When we are tracking down the X and we have that kind of brain power on our side, then I'd say we can't lose. We're at a very early stage of exposing all of this, of course, and we've been fortunate with some of the people who've come forward, like Robert Merritt, for example. So there are those things. We have understood that these key pieces of history are now opening up for us. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Olivia.
Okay, we've got everything all over the place. Okay, so easy one. Where did you find the article on Pine Gap Tricky Dick?
That's pretty interesting. It is, you can find it. It's a newspaper called The Nation. And if you dig through, it was kind of like a radical, almost like a Village Voice kind of thing for Australia. And they did a lot of crazy, like hardcore political articles. But there's a documentary that was done in the 70s in Australia by Stan Deyo. And Stan Deyo is one of these guys who's been around this space for a long time. And a lot of his work gets more into, has a more of a Christian vibe now, I would say, than when he started. So a lot of people probably in traditional alternative circles don't know him because of that. But I would say that his work in Cosmic Conspiracy was the name of his paperback. And he understood that Pine Gap was associated with Nixon's push for disclosure back then. So he's certainly somebody who would be great to speak to about it. If you want more information on it, I'm trying to get the actual article, the entire thing whole. And so we're working on that. So, but in the meantime, yes, those are some sources for it. And it's absolutely undeniable. And you can find it.
Okay, all right. So for people who have missed some of the episodes, can you ask Daniel to give a nutshell description of the time capsule?
Yeah, the time capsule is something that President Nixon described to Robert Merritt, who was someone that they had profiled, who had done good work in these various stages for the FBI and the ATF, basically spying on the peace movement mostly. But I guess they liked his style and that they could use him to do anything, including sexual blackmail. But one of the things that happened was he came to trust him. And when Watergate hit, he realized his presidency was in real jeopardy. And they would take him for meetings. He only had 3 with President Nixon beneath the White House. And those meetings are very interesting, the character of how Nixon would come to him. And I came to research around those meetings other people he would do this with. For example, Bob Haldeman, he would call up in the middle of the night. His wife would get upset and he'd say, "You have to come down here." So Nixon had weird insomnia and he liked to solve problems at like 3 o'clock in the morning. And I can relate. But there is this kind of, let's say, in relation to Merritt's work for Nixon, Merritt is one of these figures who is in the Watergate history. There are books even from 1984, like Jim Hogan book, Secret Agenda, that references Merritt. People knew about him. He's not somebody who just came forward as a whistleblower and it's hard to figure out if he's real or not. So he certainly had the background. According to him, Nixon read him this letter, which was a message to the American people that he wanted him to deliver to Henry Kissinger. And then he told him he was going to keep a copy of it in the White House. And it had this alien formula in the text, which would make any nation so powerful and energy independent and all the rest of it. And he said, because of these things that have happened, I'm not going to be able to bring this forward, but I am going to leave it and people will know. And he kind of lightened up, thinking in the future, people will remember that I did this great thing. So the time capsule is Nixon's letter that he stored in the White House in such a way that Merritt is convinced it's absolutely still there and hiding in plain sight. And Merritt offered the National Archives directions to it with the caveat that they would read it aloud and distribute it to the public and to the media. And they just stonewalled the request. It's been out there for over a month, and I think the odds for the National Archives responding have gone down, but I think there are other aspects around the administration that might be more hopeful. There might be more hopeful signs there that something will happen with it there. So yeah, there you go. The time capsule is powerful because it's a 5-page letter that contains information about the UFO file and the managing the alien presence. So I think it's absolutely crucial, and it would move the culture dramatically if it were to come out. So we're looking forward to it.
Okay, Rhonda Richardson, is DJ keeping track of Robert Merritt's health?
Yes. You know, Merritt told me himself, frankly, the first time that we spoke, that he wasn't going to be with us very long. So, but my first question to him whenever we speak is, how is your health? And so he's hanging in there, but he doesn't expect any kind of a miracle to change the trajectory that he's on. He's just trying to be as productive and as comfortable, I would say, as possible. Okay.
Okay, this is a big one. So now that DJ has led us to disclosure's door, will he speculate what is to be found behind it?
I think that you're right. We're at disclosure's door, and it has nothing to do with Navy pilots and gun footage. It has to do with having moved a technology and an understanding through different government agencies and personages that were charged with the secret of holding this information and making sure it didn't come out, and using means, including some of the, you know, there's so many people who are involved with this who their careers were ruined, their lives were threatened, whatever it would happen to be. And so I think when you look at that, the nature of the secret they're holding is transformative in this sense, which is it's not just a kind of a black and white question of there's an off-planet race visiting here. It obviously represents an entirely different kind of reality. There's no question that I don't think the technology that we discover on the other side of that after 70 years, I still don't think that we understand it exactly. And so I think that what we would find, what they think they've found, might be two different things. But I would say this: there are breakthroughs associated with the UFO file that if we were to know them, we would understand that we're operating with other civilizations. One, that's crucial. And two, we'd also notice and understand that the technology that we're looking at in the oil paradigm that we have here on Earth is absurd. And it's something that is mostly to keep the power positions in play, to keep those powerful positions right where they are, and to have the small group of controllers running 7 billion people, which is becoming more and more difficult. And they're doing stranger and stranger things, in case you haven't noticed. So I would say what we would find would be mind-blowing to a certain degree, but I feel one of the great lines that Catherine Austin Fitts uses, which is Winston Churchill before Hitler really took over, and Churchill was out there railing against Hitler and trying to say, you know, John F. Kennedy wrote a book about it called Why England Slept, which is nobody wanted to hear anything negative in the 30s before Hitler came to power. And Churchill's big line about Hitler was, tell the people. So I think we can adopt that for the UFO question, which is tell the people we can handle it, and let's work from there. That's a different kind of a problem.
Zoradax has, I think, the best question. Could Gene Dixon have the third letter?
Wow. Well, Gene Dixon is no longer with us. I do think it's a very important question. Look, Dixon, in my opinion, was the most powerful woman on Earth for a time, because she had access to presidents. She changed events. Her readings shaped, as an advisor, shaped major Middle East crises and avoided all types of things and probably spurred Nixon to move towards this disclosure, because in the 70s, she was talking about how we were coming close to locking in with the UFO consciousness and how it was going to advance, and we're going to move into Age of Aquarius and things of this nature. Well, you know, Dixon had worked her whole life on that psychic side of the fence, on the mystical end. Now, right to your question about the letter, I did investigate things about Dixon and what happened to her estate. And it turns out that an inventor friend of hers got the estate. And then when he passed away, they auctioned off all of her books, belongings, and everything else. But I think it's a fascinating question. You really aced it with the question, and thank you, because it did cross my mind that Dixon had the other letter.
Okay. Philip Gellenwater, who controls the UFO file? Grant Cameron says the president, but not so sure we all agree on that.
Grant's wrong on that one. Grant Cameron, who brings forward so much excellent information, and we all owe him a debt when getting into the UFO aspects. And he really lays it out there. I think that he's done an excellent job of dissecting the CIA action and the role of this. The problem is that the presidency has struggled over this problem since I was referring to that earlier, when Eisenhower had a stroke and then these groups came in and took this information. They moved it out of the umbrella of the presidency, and to a point where Eisenhower had to threaten them to get it back just to get briefings on it. There's no question that Eisenhower warned JFK, and when JFK got in there, he tried and did a number of things to get his hands back on the UFO file. By the time he actually shows up in 1963 saying, we're going to share our UFO intel with the Soviets, then he gets assassinated. And of course, we have the famous Howard Hunt confession to Douglas Caddy saying Kennedy was assassinated over the alien presence because he was going to give that secret to the Soviets. You know, there's a great understanding there, I think, of what we're up against relating to this. There's no question that it's outside of the purview of the presidency. And Trump, however, with his connections, now that we know that Vannevar Bush was his uncle's protege, that means Trump knows all about the UFO file, because Vannevar Bush was the hardcore man on the inside, on the scientific side, which is a particularly important thing. We've talked about Ron Pandolfi before being the top scientist in the CIA, being around this UFO thing, and he's in the middle of all these kind of mini disclosure projects where they gather information. Well, Vannevar Bush is about as high level a factor and a person as you get dealing with the UFO file. So, no, I don't agree that the president is in on it, not by a long shot. They do everything they can to keep him out of it. That's why Clinton complained about it. That's why these different people get into office. You get people like Obama who didn't even seem to care. And so, you know, one good thing is you don't have Obama to kick around anymore. Okay, what else you got?
Okay, Hugh Hoyland. Can Trump release the time capsule at any time? And does President Trump understand all these connections? Is Daniel concerned for Trump's survival?
Yes, politically, I've been concerned for Trump's survival since day one, because I think that before, we have to understand something really dramatic happened when Trump came in, regardless of whether you're Democrat, Republican, or whatever. Trump overthrew the establishment. The establishment was moving towards Cold War 2.0 and the Hillary shoo-in. And remember, that whole phony disclosure process through Podesta and Tom DeLonge came from this Hillary campaign. She was talking about it. There are these emails where she's mad at Podesta saying, hey, I memorized all this stuff about UAPs, you know, to say that, to make this fancy new term for UFOs, and the host didn't even ask me the question. We know the Clintons have been interested in this since the Lawrence Rockefeller initiatives in the 90s. Now, we run into kind of a problem when we're looking at this issue, because we're in a situation where there's a CIA block on the information coming forward. And what was the second part of that?
Can Trump release the time capsule anytime?
Right. Well,
does he understand the connection?
I get it now, yes. So in in the election of 2016, as soon as Trump got elected, they started with fake news, and they were trying to use it. Eventually, Trump would use it against them. But one of the things the CIA did was they came out in unison against him, and they were still trying in between the period when he was president-elect and took the oath of office to push something in the, the phony Russian dossier and all this nonsense that they pulled, plugging Mueller in there and all the rest of it, wasting the taxpayers' money. Trump was an incredible danger and was a total threat to that scenario in such a way, probably not since JFK have we seen that. And the reason that they could not, they had this situation where they were looking at him and saying, we don't know what he's going to do. So they've made all these plans. They have their 50-year plans. They probably include depopulation. They probably include making North America a corporate zone, the North American free zone, no more constitution. They have a series of plans. And regardless of what you think to Trump, he disrupted what they were up to. So Trump going in there, this information relating to the UFO file is very crucial, because if he knows, and I'm convinced now that he does, because of Uncle Trump. But if we go back further too and look at his relationship with Nixon, he probably knows a great deal about the topic. And their general, the people who hold these secrets and the wall of secrecy that they've erected around it, is to discredit, destroy, and eliminate their opponents who would remove their power around the UFO file and the power that they get from that, including technology. Now, remember, Jim Garrison, a lot of this wave of the stuff that we're working on, there was a big Trump release of JFK records on October 26th. And of course, we did the special for HBO about it. And really what was happening was those records got blocked, and then eventually the Garrison records got blocked, and they were all about, what the CIA did to derail the Garrison investigation of the JFK assassination in 1967. Now, his conclusion, when he spoke to the Ramparts editor, and the Ramparts editor put this in his biography, he said, Jim Garrison got me on the phone and he said, oh, we're totally wrong about the oil men being behind the assassination, at least in the way we were thinking about it. I've isolated it to a portion of the aerospace industries and the military industrial complex. Those industries, there's only a few of them. I mean, Hughes certainly was one of them, but Lockheed Martin and Boeing were others. This is where Garrison was aiming his spotlight. That's why the smackdown from on high, that's why his records still won't be released, even though they have these rolling releases. All the Garrison information is whited out. So it is perilous position for Trump. But I have to say that he is an incredible gamesman in dealing with these people on one hand. And then, if you just want to go to the larger picture of what is Trump doing and all the rest of it, it's a different question. There are some moves there, and people like John Bolton and all the rest of it coming into that administration, which don't bode well for the future, in a sense. I don't think that those are really the right players to have, but we'll see what happens. In any case, the CIA should not be allowed to remove a sitting president, especially if it's over the UFO file.
We've been talking on the chat tonight about synchronicities.
Oh, yeah.
And this has come up tonight, and it's just fascinating. So Scruples 4444. Does DJ know of a Finnish woman, Dr. Ragni Kilda?
Oh, wow.
And if so, what is his take on her?
Well, I'll tell you what's fascinating about this is there's a really excellent researcher out there who sent me her information only in the past couple of weeks. And I sort of had a vague memory of this wonderful woman, and she has an extraordinary interview with Miles Johnston from 2009. And she wrote books relating to, she did incredible research around the UFO aspects, but she wrote books relating to life after death and metaphysical interpretations of a lot of these phenomena. And it's extraordinary because, of course, we've been gobbling up all of her work, and she passed away in 2015, but was an extraordinary person. And the research that she did in the group that she worked with is an amazing story. So I look forward to finding out more about her. But great question, and really on the beam, because we just only recently came across her. She was in charge of the medical world in for Lapland, as Laplander in Finland. So just incredible.
I'm going to hop around a lot tonight. So, John Guilfoyle,
Okay.
do you think Kennedy learned about the UFO info through James Forrestal?
I don't know. What do you think?
Yes.
There's no question that he did. James Forrestal was such a key player for the UFO file, and he was the first defense secretary, and he was a fellow Catholic for JFK. So it's kind of fascinating when you piece all those parts together, because we're looking at somebody who really had the inside track and was close to Kennedy. In fact, he took Kennedy with him in his role as post-war coordinator in Berlin there. He took Kennedy with him to see the ruins of Berlin after the war, and this made a huge impression on Kennedy as well. And they had this tight relationship going down. When Forrestal dies and is pushed out that window, they say he jumped out of an insane asylum. To go from defense secretary and being on the inside track and having this dynamic situation to suddenly, going into this kind of mental facility and then jumping out a window only 2 years after becoming defense secretary shows you, and we've heard kind of the behind the scenes info about this, which is he was not comfortable keeping the UFO parts secret, and they were worried he was going to let it out. So certainly there are very interesting scenes of Kennedy as president dropping flowers off at Forrestal's grave at different times. I'm sure he knew what he was up against. Yeah, wow, incredible questions. Okay.
I'm going to switch to Tesla now. I didn't know about this. Frank Cardoza asks, can you talk about Tesla's transcendental meditation?
Well, he did. I can't go in too deep into that because there are better Tesla experts out there who know a great deal about him. I would say that he experienced these mystical states, and he had a sibling die when he was 7. And something about this shock to his psyche opened him up to this kind of more psychic world. But there's no doubt that there's something very unusual. And, Tesla makes a great case for being an alien living among us because he was just so unusual. And he had so many rules for things, and he wouldn't shake hands. And he liked to lay out 7 forks next to him when he was eating dinner. He just had a lot of very unusual things that all related. He was born during a lightning storm, and he had a lot of things about numerology, meditation. He understood that he couldn't take a wife because it would basically energetically that was going to interfere with the work that he was doing. So some real deep understanding, and who knows where it all came from. But like him reading Faust, and this is why we have to remember the power that's in the words, and the power that's in the poetry, and the power that's in things like Shakespeare. He got the information from reading Faust about the alternating current that his scientific brain brought to bear. So we have to understand that our psyche operates in such a way that we can get up to a point, and this is the great message of Edgar Cayce's work, where you can connect to all other unconscious minds and higher realms of information. So just to consider that we have that ability, and we've had people who brought that forward, like Tesla, I think is remarkable. All right, what else you got?
Okay. Do you know who really sees the Tesla files?
Well, this is interesting because the Tesla files, there's FBI files that just came out that the FBI kept on him. But you're talking about what happened to his real information, his laboratory information, and all the rest of it. And there's no question that there are trails there to different corporate and government entities because they wanted to know what he was up to. I have a feeling, though, that Tesla was very much aware of their efforts. And in calling this the Tesla Trump time capsule, I would not be surprised if there's some information that comes in about Tesla in relation to that. And I'll tell you why. There's a very famous speech that Nixon gives after he does not win versus Ford, but the convention wants him in 1976. And he said, a few years ago, I had to write this time capsule. I had to write this special thing for a time capsule that wouldn't be open for 100 years. So it's also very odd because I could never find out where the time capsule was or who it was for or whatever. Finally tracked it down to Griffith Observatories where it's held. And that observatory has such an unusual history. It's been in like the Terminator movie. It was in Rebel Without a Cause. It's just incredible panoramic view of space from there. And so they have this time capsule, and for some reason in 1972, which is the same year that Nixon placed his time capsule in the White House, according to Merritt, they had Reagan contribute to this time capsule. Well, oddly enough, in the Griffith Observatory, the exhibits are loaded with Tesla information, Tesla coils. So I think it's fascinating. You might be looking at a situation where Tesla really spread out a diffusion of his actual information. I wouldn't guess that it was all in one place for the government to just get.
Tessa Dick says it was the Office of Alien Property that took Tesla's papers.
Oh, yeah. Isn't that interesting? Absolutely. And when I was reading that, the alien part really grabbed me too, because it is fascinating. It's like they gave the whole thing away there, but of course they're referring to illegal or legal alien in this case. But it's great to see Tessa out there too. What's fascinating and what I wanted to tell Tessa, and I certainly want to share this with everyone, is that in researching the X, there were these incredible broadcasts that were, and I'll post this on Facebook, Dark Journalist, facebook.com/Dark Journalist, and some of the early science fiction shows that were brought forward. They were absolutely incredible. And I found two that were by Philip Dick, who is your ex-husband. And they were very enjoyable, and they were radio productions, but they were very well done. And they gave us a great idea of Philip Dick in his early days. So incredible, absolutely incredible writer.
Okay, Vasovic J. Did DJ come across Tesla's 1928 patent filed for a, quote, flying machine that looks like a flying disc? Has that tech been absorbed into the secret space program?
It's interesting. There's a couple, and there are people who've tracked that down deeper than I have. But I think what was happening with him was, if you think about his wireless tower for 1913 for wireless energy, he's so far advanced. But when he gets these other ideas, what's happening is there's a shutdown going on with him because he's known as the guy who will put industry out of business. So he has this incredible streak of ideas as you get into the 20s and 30s, and they just do not have the kind of support because he has almost like this kind of blacklist to him. And we do know that he spent most of his later years in the state of, real poverty. I mean, he was living in a hotel, but he was not living the life of Riley by a long shot. Whereas guys like Edison were the toast of the town, and in the history books went down that way. There's the incredible story about when Thomas Edison first employed him, and he was said, "Oh, I'll have him dig ditches," even though he was this incredible, mechanical engineer. So Edison says, "Well, why don't you solve this thing for me, and I'll give you $50,000." And it was this incredible problem around this motor. And Tesla solved the problem in pretty short order after working on it hardcore, and came to him and said, "Hey, I did it." And he said, "Oh, wow." Edison's like, "Wow, this is great. Good going. Get back to work." And he said, "Well, are we going to arrange for this $50,000? And he said, "Oh, you don't understand American jokes." So this gives us that, and Executing the Elephant, I think, gives us a pretty good idea of the character of Edison. He was a very arrogant person, and I think that was the milieu that Tesla confronted when he came into American business. Okay, we've got about 10 minutes left, so select your best questions. It's great to have everyone out there, by the way. Just a fantastic group. And I do want to say that Olivia's doing a great job with the questions over there. Keep the good questions coming, and let's keep rolling. Go ahead.
Okay, Alex Davila, have you heard about the claim that Tesla made as it relates to his ET or alien transmissions he claimed to have received at some point late in his life?
Well, we know about his initial. See, it's kind of interesting, and I would appreciate more information about that, because as I understand, that's a word of mouth thing, but it doesn't surprise me by a long shot. The thing is, in 1899, he got the signal, and he put out the message to the scientific community and to the world that he got that signal. He also talked about the idea of early satellites before we even had them up there. So he was very tuned in to this aspect, and he was always convinced that there were off-world civilizations out there that we could communicate with. And this is a guy who was really tuned in. So from his place there in Colorado, from his lab, he worked on these questions. There are some kind of like rumors that he thought he had telepathic communication with off-world visitors, but I don't know, and I need to look into that a little bit deeper, because I don't know if that's just somebody's story or if it's something he put in a biography. But I do know that when you read his actual writings, there's an incredible awareness that comes through there, and he has diverse opinions on a number of things. But he certainly understood that we were not alone, and he thought it was ridiculous. He also thought that we were adopting this, our whole scientific community went for the nuclear thing, and that there were much better energies for us to adopt, and that the atomic bomb and these types of nuclear energy were a complete detour from where we could take the planet. And as we can see now, with flashpoints like North Korea, he was absolutely right.
Want to switch gears?
Sure.
Okay, everybody wants to know what you think about OnStellar.
OnStellar is one of these things that came out of the blue, and I don't have any opinion on it, because it's one of those things which, it's supposed to. What's interesting is people have come out with pretty heavy opinions on it, like Cliff High, for example. These are people who watch crypto things. But the people getting involved around it from the Gaia side, who, in the past haven't done such great work, don't give me a whole lot of hope. So I'll put it to you that way. But certainly, I don't have any association with them, so I couldn't say for sure.
Okay, another subject that's come up tonight is Barry Trower. Do you know much about Barry Trower?
What about Barry Trower?
Do you have any opinions about Barry Trower, or would you be willing to have him on the show?
I would say if you have good information or good videos, send it to info@darkjournalist.com, and I'll certainly check it out.
Okay.
Wow, this is good. You guys are you're highly motivated. Okay, let's take a few more questions.
So Lee Veltman, this is a big question. How much does the propaganda affect disclosure, including Mockingbird media psyops?
Oh, well, that's all it is. That's why we point out what's happening with the To the Stars Academy. It's the best propaganda that we've seen. And we can see them enlisting elements of the media that usually didn't touch the UFO subject, but now have an interest in it. Suddenly Tucker Carlson wants to talk about the UFO threat. And, the military aspect of this, the CIA thinks they can sell it. Hey, we'll sell it to the military, and we'll be the puppeteers in between, and we'll mess with all these different things. If we can get it into our heads that the CIA cannot be trusted with the UFO file, with UFO disclosure, it makes everything a lot easier, because then people like Elizondo, in this whole range of people, Mellon and all the TTSA people. Did you notice that at some point that TTSA came out, and then the next time they came out, it was just surrounded by CIA people? Well, they had been there underneath, but they decided to show up. And now we have to deal with them in the media talking about the subject and not answering the real questions that people like us can put forward, because we've been studying the subject. So you get Elizondo, and he can't answer any real questions like, are you still contracted to the CIA? Because he never gets asked. You know, so the idea was that, oh, he quit. Okay, so you quit, but are you still in any kind of contract role or with any government agency? See, that's just one question that right off the bat anyone should ask. And he's done hours and hours of conversation. No one brings it up. So you know that there's a problem there. And there are people, good researchers like Leslie Kane and all the rest of it, who are getting on board with this and saying, we can't talk about the alien thing, even though she knows that that's really the object or the subject that we're talking about. And she's, you know, she's going along with that. So where are those talking points coming from? Is it Bigelow Aerospace with the CIA? You know, so that becomes a very convoluted world. Is that honest? Is that transparent? No. Suddenly the researchers can't mention it. You have guys like George Knapp who can't mention the extraterrestrial aspect. Well, this is a guy who kind of made his bones on that, right? The Bob Lazar story was all about them storing aliens at Area 51 with all these UFO things. So is he disowning his own story because Luis Elizondo and Bob Bigelow won't let him talk? I mean, you know, what kind of journalism and research is that? Like, and who are these people coming in with these protocols because they're billionaires and because they have CIA control? I mean, these are the last people you want to trust with that. So you're absolutely spot on. There's propaganda arm, and it reaches into our politics, and now it's reaching into UFO study.
Okay, CJ Hahn, whatever happened to the old dying CIA agent Richard Dolan interviewed?
Well, he's Cooper, who I keep referring to. He's actually Linda Moulton Howe's. She talked with him for 15 years and brought him out. Strangely, they dropped the ball there when they sent Dolan to interview him, because Dolan didn't know anything about him. The story, Linda had brought him out for 15 years. So they just kind of threw Dolan in a hotel with him to talk to him. And Dolan didn't really understand. I mean, you got the basic picture, but she'd been working with him for 15 years. So that might have been a very different conversation. As I understand it, his health was pretty bad back then. And I don't actually know if he's still with us, but I will check with Linda and find out for you.
Okay, Rupert, I'm still puzzled about the contradictory voices concerning Roswell, true or false, as per the body snatchers in the desert theory of British researcher Nick Redfern.
Well, listen, that's very interesting. Thank you, Rupert. Well, I'll tell you, every once in a while, these things come up. Roswell was such a hardcore media explosion in the 90s because this information came out. And so there are all these kind of strange extrapolations around it afterwards. But the fundamental story is very clear. Jesse Marcel is in charge of this base that controls the atomic, the 509th group. They control the atomic bomb. And they show up and they tell him to go out, that this rancher has found a UFO. He goes out and he finds this incredible stash of what looks like big crashed machine. And it spreads out a mile. Think about that. So Marcel is an absolutely unimpeachable source, in my opinion. And they made him say it was a weather balloon and all the rest of it. So all the things that they try to say, well, Roswell is the smokescreen or whatever. No, it's a very solid, hardcore story. Got blown out beyond all proportions. Guys like Nick Redfern, who do an excellent job at tracking down different things. I'm reading his Pyramids in the Pentagon book, which is an excellent little book. So I appreciate his research. However, every once in a while, they come up with these things to explain Roswell as some different type of an incident. And it's good to look at it. But the incident, the body snatchers idea, which was that they used these mutilated children from Japan to do these tests and all the rest of it, you know, that's mixing stories up. And there's nothing solid, in my opinion, whereas there are so many solid witnesses around the actual Roswell incident. So I completely think that Roswell was an extraterrestrial crash. It makes a lot of sense to me. We had many others afterwards, like Aztec. And I think that just like Annie Jacobson's book, which was largely drawn off Nick Redfern's book, which had all these crazy things going on. They had Dr. Mengele teaming up with Joseph Stalin and sending this craft over here. None of that adds up or makes sense. Certainly there are alternative views about Roswell, but the sheer effort on behalf of the United States government to shut down with the Air Force story in the mid-90s, case closed and all the rest of it, and all the ridiculous nonsense that they came out with covering it up, tells me that it was a real story, and that's why it lingers in our cultural memory and history even now. Okay.
Okay, I'm gonna go for the crazy question. Jack Russell, what does DJ think happens when we die?
Isn't that fascinating? I think the best material around this that has come out is around this theosophical, anthroposophical view, which is a very Western esotericism, borrowing those Eastern elements. And I think the two work very well together. And I think Edgar Cayce's work gets into this also. I think what's crucial for us to understand is that reincarnation is something that we had in Christianity until it was thrown out by the Romans, who felt that, oh, if they think they have another life, they won't be fearful in this one, or something along that line. So there was a control aspect going on there with the story. So we had, in esoteric Christianity, there's the understanding. There's a point where Jesus says, when the disciples are talking to him, they say, is Elijah going to come? And he says, Elijah came already, and they did with him whatever they wanted to. And then the disciples understood he was speaking of John the Baptist. And the suggestion there is that Elijah reincarnated as John the Baptist, and that's just what Jesus was saying. So I think it's important not to throw reincarnation out of Christianity. I think in esoteric Christianity, it is there. But I do feel that there's been this push-pull going on with this. But certainly evidence of reincarnation, evidence of communication between relatives and loved ones who have passed on, I think it's beyond dispute. But certainly whatever it is, it relates to development. And what I always found fascinating from the Cayce work is that he had said, when you leave this system, when you advance to a certain point where you are going to kind of master this system, the doorway out is Arcturus. And I'll leave that one there, but there's a lot to follow up on that answer.
Okay. How many more questions you want to take?
No, whatever you got, keep rolling.
Okay. All right. I know that we covered this before, but I promised Ron Carr, he really wants to know about Valthor. Is he a fiction or reality? If you have any specific data.
I think Valthor is interesting. I think that Frank Strange's book on him, Stranger at the Pentagon, is pretty compelling. I think there's information that crisscrosses through other people, like whistleblower Phil Schneider before he died. He mentioned that he had met Valthor. And of course, Nixon plays a very big role in this. It requires a lot of imagination to get into what Valthor was. The idea was he was this interstellar visitor who was very well dressed, showed up at the Pentagon one day and said, I have all this information for the president. And they did all this stuff to figure out what his deal was. And then they decided the president should meet him, etc. I don't think that the story has to be real necessarily. I think that there could be elements of it that Val is kind of a composite figure of some things that have happened relating to our government dealing directly with an off-world presence. We've had the stories about Eisenhower taking time off from his schedule in order to do this. I think what's interesting is some of the hardcore researchers who go after that, like Stan Friedman, for example, actually think there's something to it. And they think the paper trail around it, that is the Eisenhower meeting. So I feel like maybe something came out of that Eisenhower meeting and we got Valthor. However, Frank Strange's, who was a preacher and an interesting guy when he met Valthor. I'm sure that he met someone named Valthor who told him all these things. But I don't know if that person was an alien or not. It's hard to say.
Okay, all right. Everybody wants you to go back to Arcturus. Like, get right back there.
I'll do a show about it. I promise I'll do a show about it.
You got to give him a little more than that.
Well, I think it's fascinating because there's a lot in relation to Arcturus about the pyramid too. And if you look back at Casey's history, when he said he was Rata during this period, 10,500 BC, and that it was Rata working with Hermes and these other Atlanteans who set up the Giza complex. I'll tell you what's always missed in that story that Casey tells, and we have all the thing about the Hall of Records and the Sphinx. But actually what he says they were doing on the Giza Plateau was archaeology, which means that that site was already ancient. So, you know, we in traditional history go 2,500 BC for the Great Pyramid and the Sphinx. And in the Casey history, you go 10,500 for the Atlantean. The last change, and all the Atlanteans come into Egypt and take over, basically. And it's a huge switch out. And that continent is gone. And they were the most powerful, but they don't have their big weapons anymore. So it is a fascinating story that he tells. But the thing that's so crucial that I think is missed is that these people, like Rata and Hermes, in sizing up the Giza Plateau, are doing archaeology to figure out where's the good place to put this. And that they're already doing archaeology and find old structures at Giza before they even put it up in 10,500 BC. How old is that site and its relationship to Arcturus, which is what Casey suggests? That is an absolute study for a few shows. There's no question about it.
I got to go for it. Philip Gillenwater, Wilcock claims he's Casey reincarnated.
How dare you? It's Olivia joke night. Nicely done. No, he isn't.
Enough said.
And you know, what's really awful is, you know, Edgar Casey did incredible work for 40 years. He left us thousands of reading, 14,000 life readings. He suffered. He did a lot, and he expanded our vision of things. Can you imagine having this life and doing all this effort and then having some Johnny-come-lately show up 50 years later after you suffered and really didn't even make any money during your life, but afterwards people recognized you. And he shows up and says, hey, I'm him. It's one of the lowest things that you can do, even if you think it's true, is show up and say that you're some famous figure in history. I think it's absurd. And
can I chime in?
Yeah.
Okay. And what matters is what we're doing now, not what we supposedly did in a past life, right? Yeah.
Let's get real. That was a gimmick, a money gimmick. I'll tell you a weird thing. The guy who put him up to it is a guy named Wynn Free. W-Y-N-N Free. Great name, right? And he put up a book where he said Casey's Wilcock looks like Casey. He's the reincarnation of. But then after that, he put up a book of his friend, and he said she looks just like St. Catherine. He did the same thing with the pictures and the family and all the rest of it. So it was his gimmick, you know. So I think the really deplorable thing in the grand scheme of it is that somebody like Wilcock years after would still go along with that phony story. And, you know, that's too bad. That's pretty low level. I think we've been operating at a much higher level tonight.
Someone was asking whether you recalled any of your past lives.
Well, I've gotten into it. I've gone into it a little bit, for sure. I've spent a lot of time trying to regress those memories. I've worked with some extraordinary people who've told me things about them. I can definitely tell you that Egypt was involved. That's for sure.
Okay. Sorry.
You're doing it now. Okay, we'll do it. We'll do 5 more minutes. And
I don't hear Alex Davila again. I don't hear DJ speak on contactees or his thoughts on ETs. If he has an interest on this matter, what is the most impactful contactee case and why? UFOs are real, but what about the occupants?
Oh no, there's incredible stories about contactees, and I met them, I believed them, and I've known some of the most extraordinary who the public have never even heard of. And or they might have even heard of them in other capacities, but they didn't realize they were contactees. And I think it's extraordinary. I think there is some great solid cases through history that let us know that these people and their experiences are real. I consider the Allagash incident one of the best in history. It happened up in Maine. The Betty and Barney Hill case right here in New Hampshire, close by to us here in Boston. And, you know, these are people who the experience intruded in on them in their lives. And we saw that through John Mack's work. I had the luxury and the great fortune of meeting John Mack and speaking with him and knowing his assistant and when he was here with us. And, you know, that's the kind of level, him being a professor at Harvard, you know, I think that we should take the best people we have and put them on the job of what the UFO file is all about. But certainly there are extraordinary contactees. Boy, these questions are getting good just as we're winding down.
Tessa Dick is asking if you're ever going to call her, but do you have her contact info?
I do. And Tessa, yes, you can imagine all this time capsule and X stuff throw my schedule into a basket. But you and I are going to have a terrific conversation. I look forward to it. I admire you and the work that you've done and the work that Philip did.
Okay. Here's a big one. A cult fan. Is it possible that rocket-based travel is not how space travel is conducted, but rather is more akin to dimensions, consciousness, and Enochian magic, and even stargates?
Wow. Oh, a cult fan has the question there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here's the thing. There is magic involved at a certain level with space travel. It's undeniable. We've gone through the history, the JPL setup and how that got going and how Crowley had a role. And I think Richard Hoagland's work touches into this area. I don't think there's anything comprehensive that we understand in relation to it, but space itself, just considering, you know, there's a whole aspect in these secret societies that understand the space aspect. And when we're looking at things like the Masonic influence around it, we know that they do so many of the, and the Masonic representing a real echo of the mystery schools all the way back to Egypt and beyond. And, you know, the Masons, there's so many different things to consider about them, and you can say they're bad or good, but on their core level, at one point, they had a very deep tradition of passing down these esoteric secrets. So there's no question, I think, that there is some aspect to space that relies on this kind of supra knowledge and not just the kind of nuts and bolts, which is why it's always ridiculous when they're like, aliens can't be visiting here. It would cost too much gas, you know, to get them all the way across. How could they do it? It would take too long. It's just because we don't understand how they travel. That doesn't mean that they can't do it. You know, it's just like, you know, you don't have to defy the laws of gravity. What you do when you fly a plane is you introduce the law of aerodynamics. These are complementary things. And, you know, I learned that what they do with the media is they talk to you on the level of a sixth grader. That's their understanding of you. And that's what they do with a lot of these subjects. But your question was a little more esoteric than my answer, but I think you get the idea.
Okay. Heather Polly, please ask DJ about how wormholes relate to space travel and the magic of advanced technology. A lot of people are talking about the magic of physics.
We just touched on that, but I would say that you're right. This idea of wormhole, we're on the precipice of incredible understandings about it. And of course, they already understand things that are way out of our field of understanding what they're giving us. You know, they're telling us things about black holes they probably found out 40 years ago. So I'd say that we're operating with really blinders on, because Blue Gemini was a program they tried to take secret, 1962. Okay, so we're here 56 years later. How far is that secrecy divide now? Okay, we had the ability for Kennedy to pull back Blue Gemini and unplug it. But can you imagine the things that have gone on in the meantime? What happened to the space program in the 70s? Why did Nixon turn it into a space shuttle program? What happened to it? I mean, these are the questions, and it's kind of a myth now, right? When Trump says, "Oh, we're going back to space," and everyone's like, "Ah, ha, ha, we're going to Mars." Sure, we are, Trump. I mean, it's weird. Why shouldn't we? Of course, we should be. You do have companies out there like SpaceX, and we didn't get into all of his X connections in this episode because it was just one too many. But the truth is, there's some very unusual things in relation to the private-public aspect. The public program has less funding through NASA than it did in 1965. It's absurd. So something needs to change in our realization about space. And, there is a report coming out that Solari is going to do, Catherine Austin Fitts, and it's going to be about the space economy. And she put one out 2 years ago, and the headlines are still catching up to that one. I'm still learning about it. But the space economy is here. It's coming. And the space fence is is the hammer on top of that. So thank you. 2 more questions.
Okay. Well, since we're on magic, has DJ watched the Afterlife Investigations, which can be viewed on YouTube? What are his thoughts on the paranormal as it relates to ETs, extra dimensionals, or space beings?
Well, I'll tell you what's fascinating, and I'll mention this, which is Graham Hancock has done a series of studies about DMT through ayahuasca and these different things, but isn't a guy who believes in aliens. That when he goes into those states, and when he kept a diary about doing that, he would see what looked like grays in that state. So it does, on a certain level, make you wonder. Someone mentioned Kilda earlier, and she talked about this contactee who said that when he was taken, that, and this was in Sweden now, in the 70s, that when he was taken, they brought him up to the moon, and he saw deceased relatives there. It's very odd the way these things converge. But I think back to the cases like Betty Andreasen, who was coming from this kind of Christian viewpoint, and here we are coming into Easter. And all of her aliens kind of look like, I mean, aside from being the traditional gray, they sort of look, they're dressed up like the high priests of Jerusalem. So, the way that we're looking at things, the way these realities communicate with us are absolutely fascinating. And what they're using as a vantage point to teach us is also fascinating. I'd say it's something that we need to, this is why in those cultures, in those native cultures, that they have shamans and people who go into those states. It's like we need people who specialize in that to take us into those states. And people who have that kind of dedication, because we do have these abilities which would allow us to see a much bigger reality than the one we usually confront, for sure. But how do we integrate that into a culture like this one? So the fundamental answer to your question is there is an aspect of the UFO contact and the UFO reality which gets us into a totally different area around consciousness development. There's no question about it. Last question.
All right. Najat is dying for me to ask this question. Okay, so back to Tesla. We're clearly going to have to do another show on Tesla. Did Wilhelm Reich and Tesla ever cross paths? Reich also had a beam to deter UFOs.
Yes. Thank you, Najat. There are incredible fans of Wilhelm Reich, and he did some very interesting things. But there's a little bit of a jack of all trades thing that people do with him, which is, they've got Reichian energy over here, and they kind of, he's overplayed in a way, in my opinion, for the work that he was doing. Interestingly enough, some of his most important work was around his travels. And on his travels, when he was in the Himalayas, he saw a UFO, and he became fascinated by the subject. I do feel that his work and the philosophy around his work is absolutely crucial, and is a great study. I think once in a while I see Reich's stuff being kind of thrown around in all these different areas for me. I'm not saying that you're doing that. It's just that what I feel with Reich is that he was after this, he had this whole thing about the orgone energy, and he was after this fundamental understanding of the central role that energy plays. And I think he was getting very close. I understand that he was fascinated by Tesla. I don't ever recall seeing anything where he met him. And so they were kind of contemporary, so it's possible, but I'm not aware of it.
Okay, last question.
Yes.
People want to know what you rock out to.
Well, I mean, I listen to so much stuff. Huge fan. Like, I like Peter Murphy's work. I think he's extraordinary. Of course, all of Bowie's work with Brian Eno, I think, is excellent. Bowie was extraordinary. I think his work was great. I like listening to, a lot of classics like Chrissie Hynde and people like that, for sure. Am I leaving anybody out?
Blondie.
Yeah, Blondie was incredible. But I have a retro. The thing about me, though, even when I was 9 or 10 years old, my sense for things was completely retro. So I've always had a throwback sense to everything that I do, and that there's an appreciation of stuff that's come up. I do think that music, though, had a kind of freedom in the late 70s and early 80s that it got lost under corporate hammer later. So you had tons of bands who would experiment with things, and there's just this whole range of exciting things that happen musically if you track this period between about 1976 and 1981. So I think that would be an incredible, it's just an incredible period, and it's pretty exhilarating when you go back there, because you have all these people like Susie Sue is amazing, absolutely phenomenal. I mean, PJ Harvey and people like that who came later, I also had great respect for and really loved listening to.
Old 50s music?
Old 50s music. I love Chet Baker. Good God. I could literally give you an incredible list. But I do feel like there are things. The 50s period is like that too. It's like I was saying with the 70s. It's unfettered in a way. They're trying things. It's experimental. It's new. And the 60s is like that. We get some of the most extraordinary people in the 60s.
Terry Tolkien right here says, I drove the van for Bauhaus's first U.S. tour, by the way.
Whoa!
Would love to hear those stories.
That has to be 1982. Unbelievable. Wow. Well, we're going to have to hear more about that, Terry. Thank you so much, everyone. We had a great time being with you tonight. Olivia, you did an extraordinary job.
Thank you, everyone.
She did great. And now we're at a different place as far as the whole story around X and Trump and the UFO time capsule are concerned. We really, I think, are moving into different territory with it. I want to advise everyone to go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, because you're going to keep track of what we're doing with the shows. And it's our way of communicating with you. It's more direct. And we also know that the social media platforms are just under attack. Don't be shy to support the show in any way that you can. Subscribe to the show, share the videos, and get the word out. I think we're getting close now, and I think we can see, that the audience here in the conversation, the way that you guys are talking and the things that I'm giving in my own research, we're very simpatico. And that's something I really appreciate, because it's a great inspiration for me. And so I'm very glad that we're moving in this direction. Now, I will say this, that we have some extraordinary shows coming up for April, and it's going to be a mind blower of a month. No doubt about it. And next week, we're doing a research trip. There'll be a video, but we may not be live next Friday, but a week from Friday, we'll be back, unless we're back earlier. And we'll be back with another live show. So thank you so much for joining me. And let's keep on with the X, and have a great evening.
Good night, everybody.
That's good.